Osborne today, and I'm presiding this plenary session. So we invite Jonathan for his talk. So this session will be 1 hour. So his presentation will be like 40 or 45 minutes, and the Q&A will be like 10 or 15 minutes. So after that, we have a group photo, okay? So you stay there. Okay. Okay, so I will talk about Jonathan. I asked him when he came to Korea for the first time, and I heard it's a 19 something. Yeah, so I met him in 2006, and he visited here tomorrow. So this time is the 4th visiting to Korea, I think. Is that right? Okay, whatever. Okay. Okay, so I look at his CV, and he earned his bachelor degree in 1972 in London. Am I right? Okay. So I'm trying to guess how old he is. Okay. I earned my PhD in 1991. He got his bachelor degree in 1972, and I'm 50 years old, but I cannot count how old he is. Anyway, he traveling long trip. Okay, from Stanford, San Francisco. Okay. So anyway, he might be very sleepy right now because it's AM. Okay, oh, he's okay. Okay, so we welcome him, and he's talking about the literacy. So why literacy is essential to science. Okay, so we welcome him for his talk.
Right, thank you very much for that introduction. I just hope I can follow on those wonderful performers and keep you awake like that. Sorry, I just got to check the technology. Does this work? Does this work? No, that's the pointers, right? Okay, I'm going to use the... That's it, right, that's it. Okay, fine. Okay, let me tell you, the title of the conference is Language, I think Science and Discourse is in there somewhere. And so what I'm going to try and do in this talk is give you, I think, a summary of the many arguments about why I think literacy in science is important. Okay, now it's not the same as science literacy. This is the teaching of reading, writing, and talking. And in doing this, I'm going to draw on some of my work that I've done in this field, but lots of other people's pieces of work. This is a book I had a long-standing concern about this because I think it's underemphasized in science education. So, okay, in 2001, Jerry Wallington and I wrote this book, which was trying to make the case for why it mattered in that sense. Other pieces of work that I've been involved in, are making the case that argument in science education, which is really essentially an oral and written discourse, matters in this particular article. And then the more recent piece of work was a 5-year project funded by the Institute for Educational Sciences to look at how we could teach the reading, teach teachers to support reading to learn in science. And this is a website which is out there, which you're welcome to look at. Many of the things, illustrations that I'm going to use are drawn from that. But it's not just my work that I'm going to be doing from that point of view. So, why does science education, or why does literacy matter in that particular way? Well, there is what I call the standard model of science education, which you can see happening across a lot of the globe. Nobody's going to say that science isn't hard, so the first kind of thing involved is to think hard and figure it out. Okay, tell the students how to understand it. All you have to do as a good science teacher is explain it well, and then you give them a problem to solve, and if they solve it, yes, it's all done, that's it. Unfortunately, there's of course a large slice of people who don't succeed, and so the answer is these students are either lazy or they're poorly prepared, and they are a bit of a problem, so we don't worry about them, in that sense. Or alternatively, we just go around and tell it again louder, and we hope that it works this time. Now, I think the standard model, and all the research evidence is that the standard model is highly flawed, that only a very small percentage of students actually get it, and for many students are left, I think, with a difficulty in comprehending it. So the issue from that point of view is why should we worry about literacy in science? Well, I think the answer to that is traditionally, as I said in that standard model, science teachers have not paid much attention to texts. It's always been somebody else's job to do this. Okay? They're supposed to prepare them to do the reading and the writing beforehand. This is what I call the vaccination model of literacy. Somebody else should have vaccinated them with that beforehand, before they got into the classroom. And then I think is a problem, okay, and that we as teachers of science and as teachers of science educators have to take on the responsibility for doing it. And why do we have to do that? And the short answer to that is because literacy matters. Okay, and it matters increasingly because there's a high correlation between literacy and science performance. The more you can read, the more you can comprehend and write, the more likely you are to achieve in science. If you look at the PISA tests, for instance, the reading tests and the science tests correlate highly. Okay? But I think one of the most powerful arguments I think I've seen recently comes from a book written by David Baker from the University of Pennsylvania called The School Society. And he's making, I think, a very important point, which is that we in education have failed to acknowledge that in the past 100 years there has been an enormous transformation in society. We have gone from a situation where the education was the privilege of a few, to where education is now seen as a basic human right of everybody. And in doing that, there has been a shift. There's been a shift to an emphasis on higher order cognitive capabilities. Rote memorization is not good enough for all kinds of reasons these days, and literacy is fundamental to developing those kinds of higher order cognitive capabilities. There's also been a shift to acceptance, what you might call the epistemic authority of science, that we look to science to validate the reasons we do things and why we believe in things, with the exception, of course, of the American president. But everybody else, I think, again, does that. Then there is the dominance of what you might call universalism, which is that we no longer hold dear to our heart local forms of knowledge, but we look to forms of knowledge that are universally available to all and useful to all kinds of people. Now, in his book, one of the things that he points to, which you could, sorry, okay, I put this. You can't see it, okay, I had to transfer this to PowerPoint and the graph has gone off the top. Okay, I'm sorry I can't show it to you, but what it shows, if you can't see it in the book, okay, in the graph, is that it's an analysis of textbooks, okay, and you can see that bit from 1904 to 1991, 2000. It's looking at the ones which make problem-solving demands and the ones which make what you might call more abstract and conceptual demands. And the graph gradually goes up like that from that point of view. So we are seeing this shift within education, and we are seeing a shift to higher order cognitive capabilities, making greater literate demands in that sense. You've seen that shift as well, I think, within science education in two particular spheres. One was with this document, a framework for K-12 science education, which is the foundation of the next generation science standards, and a document with which I was involved in the writing from that point of view, but it puts a particular emphasis in that sense on outcomes measured in terms of performance expectations. This is a big fundamental shift which I think you are seeing in many societies. What's the difference? The difference is what students are expected to do at the end of their education, or various levels of their education, is not defined in terms of what they know and understand, but in terms of what they can do. So these are a couple of these performance expectations from the next generation science standards, and students are supposed to develop a model that predicts and describes changes in particle motion. Or they are supposed to use arguments supported by evidence for how the body is a system of interacting subsystems. And those are more demanding for students, and that in turn means that we, involved in our teaching of science, have to think hard about how do we build those cognitive capabilities to do that in that kind of way. You see it also in the PISA science literacy framework, and this is the basic model of the science literacy framework. There are contexts on the left, there are competencies, that students are supposed to use. And the important thing about these competencies is, again, they are phrased in terms of performance. What PISA is measuring is whether students can explain phenomena scientifically, evaluate and design scientific inquiry, and interpret data and evidence scientifically. And those are a set of 3 competencies. To do that, they have to draw on knowledge, content, procedural, and epistemic knowledge, and it's framed by a set of attitudes. So you are seeing this shift, I think, in our expectations and in society's expectations of what science education should achieve. You see that as well in the next generation science standards, in the sense that students are expected to engage in a set of scientific practices, and if you look at those scientific practices, and I think this is where this does work, hopefully. Let me try that. No? No, it doesn't work, sorry. Okay, but the last 3, okay? Constructing explanations and designing solutions, engaging in argument from evidence, obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information are all literate practices. They all demand competency with being able to read, write, and produce science in that sense. See it also in another aspect of the American curriculum, which is the Common Core State Standards. And these are the literacy standards for English language arts, but notably literacy in history, social studies, and science. And the shift within America has been to say that educating students to be literate is not just the responsibility of the English teacher. It is also the responsibility of other teachers as well. And it's that I really want to address, I think, in saying, well, what does that mean, and what do we know about what it means? Because I think one of the kinds of challenges of why I think this is important is the kind of, what I want to try and convince you, is that as teachers of science, we are teachers of crazy ideas. They may seem common sense to you, but I'm going to ask you, why should they appear to be common sense? Because they never were to start with, and you are trying to persuade your students to believe these. Trying to persuade them, for instance, that the Earth spins on its axis once every 24 hours. That means it's spinning at the equator faster than the speed of sound. Why should anybody believe that? You are trying to persuade them as well, just taking a few, I have a long list of these ideas, that the continents were once one. Why should anybody believe that? I mean, moving a whole continent, you can't even move this building in that sense. And then you're also trying to persuade them that the Earth is a sphere, okay, and that the people in Australia are somehow glued onto it and don't fall off. So you're trying to go through a set of ideas, okay, changing ideas, that you're trying to move people from believing that Earth is flat to believing that the Earth is spherical. You're trying to move them from believing that the Earth is stationary to the Earth rotates on its axis and moves around the sun in an elliptical orbit. And I'm just showing you some of the ideas you're trying to work with, and you're trying to persuade them, that the day and night, the explanation that the sun causes it by moving is not true. It's the Earth moves and the sun stays still. I've just shown you a few of them. I've got a much longer list in that sense. And so the issue is, if you want people to believe these ideas, you have to give them the opportunity to digest them by reading, writing, and talking about them. Just to give you an example, for instance, okay, in that sense, what you're trying to do, and this is the work of Nussbaum going back, I think, to the 1980s, okay, is trying to shift the young people, particularly in elementary schools, but also middle schools, okay, in some cases some adults, from believing in what you might call two-dimensional space, where there is the Earth and space and down is like that, to this model where down is an attraction towards the center of the Earth. And people struggle with that, and you can see why they struggle with that, because if you look out of the window, the Earth patently looks flat. And they go through all kinds of accommodations in order to try and reconcile these two kinds of understandings. This is one where they think there's a sphere, that we live on a flat plane within the sphere. So what we're trying to do is move people, and moving people means that you have to give them opportunities to think and reflect and engage in practices. For instance, just take this one, the idea that day and night is caused by spinning Earth. Okay. Most of us learn this in elementary school. Okay. But there are good arguments against it. Now, have you ever considered the arguments against it? First of all is the obvious one, that it's the sun that appears to move. Secondly, okay, if you jumped up, surely you wouldn't land in the same spot if it's going that fast. And then the third one, as I just mentioned, if the Earth was spinning at that rate, the speed of the equator is 1,000 miles per hour, surely you should be flung off. So, having students engage in the process of reading, writing and talking is essential if you're going to get them to digest these kinds of ideas, and if you're going to get them to come to an understanding. And in particular, giving the opportunity to work out why all of those ideas, all of those arguments are fundamentally wrong. They're good arguments, but they're wrong. And knowing why the wrong answer is wrong is as important as knowing why the right answer is right. Most of us, I think, can remember the occasions when we have got things wrong. Here's another example of this, okay, where you need opportunities to engage in the literate practices of working out the ideas, okay, rather than working with phenomena. This one confuses many people. A donkey was urged to pull a cart. The donkey refused to try, citing Newton's third law in its defense. My pull on the cart is equal but opposite to the pull on the cart on me. Since I can never exert a greater force on the cart than it exerts on me, how can I ever start the cart moving? Asked the donkey. How would you reply? Now, okay, this is what I'm trying to argue for, I think, which is that there is much more to be learnt and understood by giving students problems of this kind of nature, which require the use of literate practices in that way. Because if you don't do that, you end up with a situation in the case of Newton's laws, where, okay, the first law is essentially unbelievable, the idea that something would go on and on forever without ever slowing down. Okay, that's pretty difficult to believe. The second law, okay, F equals ma, just seems incomprehensible in that sense. And the third law, as you've just seen, becomes mere religious incantation. So the question I'm really asking is, how do we transcend that? And, okay, how do we get away from that? What I think we have to do as a community is understand that fundamentally what we're introducing to students is ideas about phenomena. And if we're doing that, again, this is drawing really on the work of David Pearson from the University of Berkeley and his colleagues with an addition, then we have to engage in a set of literate practices. Yes, we have to give students the opportunities to experience the phenomenon, but we need them to read about the phenomenon, we need them to write about the phenomenon, we need them to talk about the phenomenon, and we need them to draw it, represent it, or model it, because in science, words are not enough all the time. Okay, we have to use diagrammatic representations. So in exploring ideas, okay, basically, the epistemic acts that we are, comes from the work of Olson, that we are asking students to engage in, are the things like predicting, describing, critiquing, defining, explicating or elaborating, okay, and arguing. Now, I would probably guarantee that, okay, we have a paper that argues somewhere that this is, I can't get this to work, that, okay, critique is a very rare practice in most classrooms. We do not give enough students enough opportunities to look at problems and say, what is wrong with this response? We don't, from my own work on argument, we don't give them very much opportunity to argue as well. So the issue to some extent is how do we build these kinds of competencies with those literate practices? There's the kind of central tenet that I think I work from is, I think, summed up for me in this quote by Postman and Weingarten, written back in 1971 in a very seminal book named called Teaching as a Subversive Activity. Okay, and they said all of what we customarily call knowledge is language, which means that the key to understanding a subject is to understand its language. Okay, that's their emphasis. This means, of course, that every teacher is a language teacher. And that's the central premise, I think, of what I think we have to grasp as educators, would-be teachers. Teachers who are quite literally have little else to teach but a way of talking and therefore seeing the world. Okay, similar argument made by Jay Lemke in his book in 1990, saying the one single thing we can do to improve the quality of science education is to give students more opportunities to talk the language of science. And this matters because I think the shift in conceptualization about literacy that's happened in the last 15 years really comes out of some work by Shanahan and Shanahan. And they make the point, okay, which is that most elementary schools are involved in developing basic literacy. That's the ability to read and write the 5,000 to 7,000 words in English anyway that most of us use every day. Okay. Then there is something called intermediate literacy, okay, but then as you go into each of the disciplines, there is something called disciplinary literacy, which is the form of words and expressions and signs and symbols that are used within the discipline. To put it simply, the historian does not speak the same language as the scientist, in that sense, who does not speak the same language as the musician. And as you go up the school, and we're talking really about age 10 onwards, okay, you have to develop the competency to read and understand the language as it is used within the discipline. And nobody else is going to do that other than the disciplinary teacher themselves. The English teacher isn't going to show them how to read informational texts. That's not their competency. It's our responsibility as the teacher of science. So this takes me, I think, on to reading, which is probably the area I'm going to spend most on because that's the area I've been doing most of the work, but it's not the only area. I will hopefully, in the time I've got, try to get to some of the other areas as well. But a lot of people, unfortunately, operate with what I call the simple view of reading. The simple view of reading, okay, basically says it's about decoding words on paper, okay, and it's just a case of knowing the vocabulary. And if you know the vocabulary, okay, then you'll be able to work out the meaning of the text. Now, there are many exercises you can do which have been researched to show, okay, that this is not so. Because the reality is really what I call the complex view of reading. Complex view about reading, okay, is about taking a perspective. It's about looking at a text and interrogating it and saying, why is the author writing it in this way? What did the author want to say? What were they trying to get across to me? It requires complex reasoning because you have to make inferences about what this sentence or this paragraph is expressing. Now, any of you who have attempted to grade any of your students' work will know that kind of feeling, because most of your students, okay, are not the best at expressing themselves. It makes use of academic language, okay, in that sense. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And most of all, in order to understand it, it requires background knowledge. And the question, the key thing is how do you bring to the fore that background knowledge to help people understand it in that way. So what I'm talking about then, in fact, is not learning to read. Although, okay, undoubtedly you have to introduce some vocabulary. But really what you're talking about is helping students read to learn. Because that is the situation that you and I are in every day. One thing we can be certain of is that the world in 20 to 30 years will not be the world it is now. That many of us will have had to learn new skills, To learn new skills, we will have had to have engaged in a lot of reading in order to learn. So the more we can help students to build that competency and capacity now, the more we are giving them a skill for life in that kind of way. So let me turn to what essentially are the difficulties of scientific language, and what I'm doing is summarising much of the work that comes out, I think, out of a whole range of people, particularly the systemic functional linguists like Halliday, Schleppergrell, and other people, and Catherine Snow at Harvard. Okay, what they point to are essentially these are really the major 5 difficulties in some senses, but there are others as well. Okay, one is ostensibly the academic and technical vocabulary. The argument is that in a high school biology course, you learn more new words in that than you do in a foreign language course. Another is the lexical density, okay, the sheer number of words in a sentence. Third is what they commonly call nominalization, which is the way, in order to make communication efficient, we condense whole strings of words into single nouns. The other is the fact, fourth one is the fact that we have to use multimodality, because words fail to express some of the ideas we want to get across in science. And then the 5th one is the universal cursive language, which is the difficulty of working out exactly what is meant, because words have multiple meanings in that sense. So the first one is, and let's just talk a little bit about these tiers of words. First tier is the everyday language. This is the 5,000 to 7,000 words, most frequent words in English, the ones that you grow up with. You have no problem understanding. But then you have tier 2, which is the academic words. Okay, these aren't particularly scientific words, but they're words that most students don't use in every day. So compare, therefore, arguably illustrate. These are all the kinds of words that you and I might use in academic discourse, but not what the average student will be using. And then there's the tier 3 words, which is the technical words that got specific meaning within the discipline. Now, most of us, and I think most teachers, think that actually it's the third ones that are difficult because they're unfamiliar. No, they're not. Okay? You either know it or you don't know it. Simple as that. It's the ones that students struggle with and therefore get the things wrong are the tier 2, the academic words, because they think they know the meanings or they think they know how they're used. But the evidence, research evidence going back over 20 or 30 years from really multiple choice tests where they're asked to pick out the right, whether the word is used appropriately, is those are the words that they find most confusing. And those are the words that I think teachers of science often forget to explain and elaborate. I don't have time to show you this, but a nice piece of software developed by one of my colleagues, Kenji Hakuto of Understanding Language, is wordsift.com. Okay, the nice thing about wordsift.com is if you paste in a piece of text into it, it produces a whole set of kind of word picture of these words, ones that come up most frequently, and it allows you to pick out the academic words or the scientific words, so you can start to see what some of the words are that you should be addressing. So if you've got a moment, do have a look at wordsift.com and the kinds of things that you can do with it. But it's a nice sort of introduction to would-be teachers about some of the words that might be causing difficulty, getting them to think about the fact that actually the words that you and I understand are difficult and challenging among many students. You can see down the bottom, for instance, that it has, you can change them from common to rare, A to Z, and then it will mark different types of words, AW words, AWL is academic word list. There's a woman in New Zealand who produced a list of all these academic words in that sense. Lexical density. Okay. This is the second problem. Okay. Common English has about 2 lexical terms per sentence, possibly 3 if you call anything a lexical term. We never did anything very much about science in our school. To understand that sentence, you have to understand what word science means, and you have to understand the word school. They are reference. Then you get scientific English, you get these wonderful sentences like the atomic nucleus absorbs and emits energy in quanta or discrete units, okay, which in that case I think adds up to 8 lexical terms. That's got an important implication, which is you are not going to digest and make sense of that second sentence unless, especially if you come across it for the first time, unless you read and reread it. Okay, because making sense of that is much more cognitively demanding, and it is not something that will be understood in one particular pass. Then we get nominalization, and this is a couple of examples there. This is the process where we take verbs and turn them into nouns. Okay, you might say, well, what exactly, how does that make it difficult? Well, let me kind of illustrate this. Okay, state there are a few more examples. Movement becomes motion. Okay, the standard example of this is when we talk about the rate of growth of a glass crack, which scientists would turn into, okay, a glass crack rate. In fact, this is a kind of creeping thing that comes in our language, I notice, which is that people tend to turn things into compound nouns, as if somehow it's simplifying things. But what that means is that when you get any of these words, like radiation, evaporation, condensation, okay, as the teacher of science, these are what a student of mine calls the shunnification of words, shun at the end, okay? Okay, you have to explain these words, because they represent a process which is summarizing into a single word something which is normally explained with many words. So, okay, nominalization is one of our third problems, okay, with language. Fourth problem, this works, pressing the wrong button, okay, is multimodality. Multimodality, if you want to explain how the heart works, okay, you try doing it in words, it's very difficult. So we don't do it in words. We pick diagrams, okay? We pick diagrams like this. You always recognize that as the heart, okay? But these diagrams summarize a lot of complex information, and making sense of those diagrams is not straightforward and easy, and students have to be taught what it represents. How you do that effectively is obviously another issue, but the point is these diagrams have to be decoded, and it's not just these ones, there are other ones like this. Okay, this is one representing trophic levels in an ecosystem, and you're looking at it and you ask, well, what do the yellow lines mean, what do the red lines mean, what do the blue lines mean in that sense, and how does this represent a complex process? Similarly, you have symbols and models that are coming up quite a lot. Again, those have to be understood and comprehended. Okay, then you have charts and graphs, so there are lots of these that have to be comprehended as well. And okay, then these days, of course, you have visualizations, which is another thing which has to be decoded as well. This one's rather fun. Whoops, sorry, go back. Not sure I can get that one too. If I can get it to work in one go. If it's going to run. I think in exporting it to PowerPoint, the answer is it's not going to run. Sorry, okay, it's not going to run. But what it shows is the tsunami, this is the one off Indonesia in something 2004. But again, it has to be read if you're going to interpret it, because it shows diffraction and reflection, and you have to show people these phenomena if they're actually going to see it. And all the research evidence on visualizations, and there's an emerging body of research evidence on this, says that these are difficult for many students to read and understand, so that they have to be taught explicitly. And then finally, of course, there's the dreaded mathematics. Okay, but it's not just mathematics, so this formalism and symbolism which is difficult for students. Okay, there's a whole set of mathematics to do with simple charts, tables, Venn diagrams, which has to be used and explained and introduced as to why we make use of these particular forms. Okay, sorry, the fifth problem is polysemy, or the fact that words have multiple meanings. So one of the worst examples or uses of this is that we are very loose about the use of the word in the English language, electricity. So we write sentences like that. Electricity is transferred across the country on wires. So what does it mean? Does it mean electrical energy? Does it mean electrical charge? Does it mean electrical current? Does it mean electrical power? It actually means electrical energy is transferred, but we don't tend to do that and you leave it to students to work out the meaning. And this is something that students need to be helped with if they're going to make sense of the challenge of reading scientific texts. So the question then is, okay, from that point of view, is how do we tame this beast of scientific texts? In particular, how do we support students to comprehend and make sense of these texts? And this again, I think, comes back to this idea of thinking about these literate practices and how we support them. And one, obviously, that I'm interested in talking about now is how we support the reading of science in that way. Well, as I said, on the website we've summarized much of this information. What I think we did in doing this work was pull together a lot of the work on the teaching of reading and apply that in some senses to supporting in science. Nothing is particularly what I would call innovative. This work has been out there for a period of time. What I don't think has happened sufficiently is we haven't embedded this into our thinking about training pre-service teachers, about in-service education for teachers as well. So many of them are unfamiliar with this. And that, I think, bothers me, in some senses, because the thing that distinguishes a professional from an ordinary layperson is that they have a body of knowledge that the layperson doesn't. So the question one has to ask of any of us, I think, engaged in science teacher education is, what is it that distinguishes the science teacher from the scientist? What knowledge do they have that the scientist doesn't have? Otherwise, if we're short of science teachers, it's just a question of pulling any reasonable scientist off the street and asking them to teach science. I don't think that is what we should be doing, but that, I think, is the question that I'm posing. And I'm posing that, I think, in thinking about how do we support the teaching of reading in science, and that this is some of the knowledge that I would expect a would-be teacher of science to have. First thing I expect them to have is an understanding that if you want to teach, because of the complexity and difficulties of scientific language, then, again, you need to understand that reading is not receptive. It's not like reading a book. You need to break and reread, and you need to structure that so that the students will engage in that as a task, from that point of view. Why does it need to be reflective? Because of all of these kinds of arguments. The standard text has this very often unfamiliar passive voice, which students find difficult. It's lexically dense, it has nominalizations in that sense. It rarely has a question in it. Really odd that, because most science is about answering questions, but you can pick up most textbooks and you wonder what question they're answering. That, again, makes it hard to understand. So one of the things you have to train people to ask is what kind of questions are being answered, and it's got lots of academic language. So that's one of the reasons that it has, these are the reasons, okay, in that sense. So how do we support it? Well, the basic paradigm in all the research is you need to think of it in terms of a three-step strategy. Any kind of reading activity, or any literate activity, has a before, during, and after. The important function of the before part of that is to activate or elicit the prior knowledge that you would need to make sense of this particular idea. During is a strategy that promotes comprehension by encouraging breaking and rereading and synthesis. After are strategies that encourage organization of text information for recall and review. So to give you an example, for instance, if I really wanted you to remember what I'm saying now, okay, I would get you all to write a 5-minute or two, 3 or 4 sentence summary at the end and share it with the person next to you. Because otherwise, okay, in a conference like this where you're bombarded with lots of things, you're probably likely to remember 2 or 3 things. Okay. And summarization is an essential key to remembering things. So what kinds of things work with pre-reading? These, again, are useful things to think about, which is that if you have a piece of text, then an anticipation guide is a good thing. An anticipation guide extracts from the piece of text the statements that are in it, and it puts on a table like this, and it asks students whether they think this is true or false, okay, before they have read the text. So there's an element of, have I got it right? Have I not got it right? Okay, it's an anticipation. It brings you, engages you with the reading. It's a kind of, works in that kind of way. Okay. Then you get what the text says afterwards. Okay, did you get it right or not? Okay. And then what's the evidence from the text that supports that particular view? Because in some senses, that's what all texts are. They are evidence for a particular view. So this is, can be used both as a pre-strategy and an after strategy in that sense. But the anticipation guides are useful in that way. And they don't take long to prepare. They engage students in the process of reading. And that's what we have to do. We have to make these literate activities cognitively engaging if they're going to help students. What about during reading? Okay, well, during reading, I think the main work that's been done here in that sense comes really from a project that was about 40 years old now, but talked about what they called directed activities related to texts. It was they had a book called Reading to Learn in Science, which you can still find somewhere on Amazon. And they made this argument that it's important to get students or pupils to locate the important information and reflect on it, to categorize it, and to record it. And they developed a whole sets of activities which they call darts. And they're really two types of darts. There are restructuring darts, where you are given text with bits that are missing, or sentences that are jumbled in that sense, or diagrams that are missing labels. And your job as the student is to put the text, make sense, put the text and make sense of it, or to relabel the diagram in that kind of way. The other type of dart are analysis darts, where you are asked to underline. So underline all the bits that are about atoms, or underline all the bits that are about molecules, okay, or produce a table which summarizes what is in the text. And these are tremendously important skills which students can then use in later life in all kinds of other areas. Okay. Labeling, where you write a note on the side of the paragraph. Okay. And then the one which I like but is not very familiar, which is the question the author, which is trying to ask questions of why did the author put the diagram there? What did they mean by using this particular analogy in that way? And that is a powerful technique. So these exist, okay, and one can expect, I would expect a professional teacher of science to at least be aware of them, even if they don't use them. This is, a standard one about the eye, for instance, where you have a piece of text about the eye, and it refers to the diagram, but you've taken the labels. So, okay, using the text, work out what the labels are. Okay, it's cognitively challenging, you have to think about it, and you have to think about the actual parts of the eye, and it helps you to remember them. Post-reading, well, the one that I think we've had most success with is this thing called the Freya model. Okay, and Freya model, okay, is a good summarization technique in that sense. It's got 4 boxes. You put the word in the middle. There's a phenomenon representing, say, for instance, evaporation. What is the definition in your own words? Okay, what are the characteristics or features of it up there on the right? What are examples of this? And crucially, what are non-examples? And everybody, when they use this technique, says the things that really help them in understanding the concept is not so much the examples, but the non-examples. It's a case of knowing what it isn't helps you to know what it is. And that is seen as being quite powerful in that way. So Freya models, I think, simple to do, but very cognitively useful. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about talking science. This is, I think, a challenge for most of us in that sense, because as you're probably familiar with, the standard dialogue within most classrooms is IRE. There are all kinds of reasons for that, why it's the dominant pedagogic discourse, but one of the challenges I think we face in classrooms, there is a move or a shift to an emphasis on discourse. Okay? How do we help teachers to get out of IRE conversations? Now there's lots of ideas out there, I'm just going to talk about a few of them in that way and what I think some of the research points to. First obvious one is wait time. This is, if there's one piece of seminal research within science education, it's the work done by Mary Badreau back in the 70s that showed that if, first of all, that the average time that most teachers would wait would be less than a second. Unbelievable that. In normal discourse, okay, you don't give your person you're talking to less than a second to answer. But we do as teachers. What she also showed is that if you could train teachers to wait 3 seconds, the average length of the response increased 3 times. So that, I think, is an essential concept that people would-be teachers of science need to know about. And you have to train yourself to practice it. You have to bite your tongue and slow down and give students longer to answer. Then I think there's a very useful body of work which has emerged from the work of Sarah Michaels and Cathy O'Connor on what they call productive talk, academically productive talk. What are the kinds of things that you can do to get students to give longer answers? So one of the things is getting students to think these kinds of question stems. Can you tell me more about that? Can you explain it in a different way? What did you mean by? Okay. And what you're trying to get is teachers to appropriate these in that sense, or revoicing. Let me tell me, I think what you're saying, the important part was that. Or, okay, did you mean this by this particular answer? That's not a common question in that sense. You're giving space for the student to engage in production of language in that sense. And you, okay, or you're trying also, that provides opportunity to connect everyday language to academic language. Or you were talking about how plants produce food. Okay, we've got a technical word for that in science which you call photosynthesis. Then you get pressing and challenging. What is the evidence that leads you to believe that in that sense? Okay. Or here's another way of thinking about it. Or let me play devil's advocate. One of my favourite stories in that sense is about a teacher who had to teach about men landing on the moon, and he said, I've got to teach you about men landing on the moon, it's on the curriculum. He said, okay, but he got fed up, because every year he did it, and the students say, oh, so, it's not true, there's a conspiracy theory. Okay. Go on the internet, okay, you can find it's all faked. Okay. So he got fed up with that. Okay. So he turned it around one year and said, oh, well, I've got to teach you about men landing on the moon. He said, okay, but I don't believe it, the whole thing's just a conspiracy theory. And the students all turned around to him and said, oh no, sir, it's true. Okay. So challenging students is an important thing that we have to learn to do. And this is, I think, a useful document, Talk Science Primer. You can find it on the internet. There is a chart there, one-page chart of these kinds of questions, which I think teachers should internalize in that sense. And these are other suggestions about how one can encourage peer-to-peer talk. Can anyone add on to so-and-so's idea? What's the difference between what you said and what they said? What's the difference is a very powerful cognitive question. What's the difference between photosynthesis and respiration? What's the difference between velocity and speed? What's the difference between power and energy? You can go on and on. These help us to classify and clarify ideas. So these kinds of questions, I think, are important in thinking about how we support talk in that sense. Another way of thinking about this is, and this is from some of my own work, we had a book out recently, okay, elaborating a lot of these ideas about arguing from evidence in middle school science with 24 activities, but it's to think about the structures that support talk. So, okay, one of the ones that are useful, okay, are argument lines, where you have two contrasting ideas. In this case, Pluto is a totally legitimate planet, Pluto is a sorry little rock, okay, and students have to go to one end or the other if they're discussing this about planets in that sense, okay, and then they have to decide why they are in that location in the classroom as opposed to the other location. They have to discuss it with their peers, and then they have to discuss why they think the other students are wrong. So this is, you know, a simple way of getting students to talk science. Getting students to talk science means you are giving the opportunity to appropriate the language of science. That's just an argument line. There are also ones called four corners, where you can add in more choices, so they can go to A, B, C, or D in that sense. This is good for socio-scientific issues. Okay, so I think this is an issue in Korea. I looked it up. Okay, deforestation is bad for Korea or not? Okay, do you strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree? Okay, there is no simple answer to this, but engaging in that kind of process helps people to think about it in terms of not just the science, but what are the ecological issues that it raises. So these structures are there, and there are many more of them, but I'm just showing you one or two of them. So let me kind of finish by turning to a little bit of thinking about writing and what it means to support the writing of science, which is, again, something possibly we don't do enough of it. First of all, again, one of the things that we have to seriously think about is the fact that, okay, it is not our job, or it does not help people, okay, if they copy things, okay, either from books or from the teacher. The ability to summarize information and the ability to write meaningful notes is tremendously important. So in this sense, okay, science netbooks or Cornell notes, okay, which are a very simple idea again, okay, which is that basically it's a piece of paper which you divide into three. Okay, you have a Q column, a note-taking area, and a summary. In the Q column, you as the teacher can say, okay, I want you to make notes on these particular things. Or you can give them 3 or 4 questions, which they then have to answer by writing and responding in the note-taking area. And then they write a summary at the end. So that puts the load onto the students. And having written products in that sense, and written products doesn't just have to be written, they can be videos, they can be PowerPoints in that kind of way, are things that are important in helping students to distill and internalize the information. Another one coming from the work of Ray in the UK sometimes, is the, I think it's the 90s, is the idea that there are genres of scientific writing. There are reports, there are explanations, there are arguments, there are discussions. And the universal thing that you get in the US is sentence starters. But they took it a bit further by saying, well, okay, there are frames you can produce that will help students to produce, okay, explanations. And these frames consist, obviously, of sentence starters, but they scaffold students in the process of writing. They help them to get over that kind of sense of block, what am I supposed to write? And it takes them along into producing scientific writing. So the work of Ray on scientific literacy, on writing frames, is, I think, quite an important step in writing. But there are other ways of doing this as well. So, okay, let me finish then by saying, well, this is, okay, this, I hope I've persuaded you that this topic matters. Okay, it matters if we are to improve the quality of teaching and learning of science, and it matters if we are educating teachers. Fundamentally, science is about ideas. These are not easy ideas, they are difficult ideas, they take time to understand and comprehend. Far too many students learn science by rote memorization as a miscellany of facts. that does a disservice to the students and a disservice to the scientific ideas. You want students to emerge from their science education with some sense of what the intellectual achievement is that science represents. Some sense, for instance, of the intellectual achievement that went in changing our thinking about simply day and night. Let alone the idea, for instance, that you look like your parents because every cell in your body carries a chemically coded message about how to reproduce you. Okay. That, if you think about it, is a pretty incredible idea. So understanding those ideas requires attention to literacy. And it requires attention to thinking about how to support the teaching of reading in science, because reading in science is a disciplinary form of literacy. Nobody else is going to do it. It requires opportunities for students to engage in the talking about science, because language teachers will tell you that the only way you appropriate a word is by using it something like 6 to 7 times. And also, another way of appropriating it is to write it. Okay? And the one I haven't discussed at all is the whole process of representing and modelling, but I don't have time. And I think that's the one we know least about in that sense, but there is some work on that in terms of visualizations. But I hope I have persuaded you that this talk and the research on it is important, and that it's something that we as a community should continue to engage with. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, we have some minutes, so you can have any questions about his talks, why research in science through talking and writing, through language. Okay, Jong-won Park.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. I'm a physics educator, so I have observed that many of my physics students do not read the sentence. They mainly focus on mathematics. And they think that because the mathematics is good summary of the long sentence, they think that if they can understand mathematics, they don't need to read the sentence. So I want to change this student biased attitude. Can you give any recommendations?
Okay. Yeah, it's a long answer. I'll try and keep it to a short answer, but I think basically the fundamental problem is that, okay, they have become rooted to thinking that the mathematics is the answer. Okay, and the answer is mathematics is a language. Okay, mathematics represents an idea, and the issue is what's the idea underlying the mathematics. In that sense. So if you take just take high school piece of mathematics, okay, you're probably working with undergraduate students doing more complex mathematics in that sense. Okay, but if you can't explain what the idea is under the mathematics, I don't think you understand the mathematics. So my example of that, for instance, would be Newton's second law. Most of them know the mathematics, they can represent using calculus. But what does this really mean in that sense? Okay, how would you explain it to somebody, okay, who doesn't know mathematics as the exercise? Okay? What is the meaning of this particular equation? So coming to mind, for instance, in my experience, is sitting in second year undergraduate physics class, being taught lots of complex mathematics about electrodynamics, and I had no idea what it meant at the time, and I still have no idea what it means now to this day. So I think there's an exercise which you have to ask them to do, which is to say, okay, they're not going to read it, okay, but the exercise you have to do is, I want you to explain to me, okay, the idea that that mathematics is representing, without using any mathematics. Okay, so that, I think, is the challenge, because if you can do that, then you understand conceptually, I think, what the mathematics is representing, and anybody should be able to do that, even with quite complicated mathematics in that sense. And I'm a victim of that since I have learned pieces of mathematics that I did not understand what it was representing. So I think it'll turn around that way.
Okay. Any question? Okay, can you? 간단히 자기 소개도 좀 하고.
Yeah, thank you for your interesting talks. I'm the postdoc in the University of Busan National University in Busan. I think in my humble opinion, your talk is about scaffolding, because that kind of the class or program need a lot of scaffolding for students, such as the scaffolding for the talk in a class. So I wonder if you can give some tips or the recommendation of the scaffolding.
So I think what you're asking me is,
Yeah.
what are the references for it, or?
And actually, in some view of the practice in schools,
Yeah.
the elementary school or the secondary schools, the teacher have the many students for take. So the teacher needs some. In my opinion, the teacher needs some scaffolding for students to improve the reading of science or talk of science. So I wonder if you have some tips for the teacher.
Well,
You understand?
yeah, I think I think as a community, I think most of us are working in research and science education because we think research will produce the evidence that will inform, okay, or help to inform practice. Okay, and if it's going to inform practice, it often does it in a roundabout way, which is that, okay, it informs us, and then that informs the practice of how we educate teachers. So, okay, there's a sense in which, so if you went to this website I was talking about, Reading for Learning in Science, okay, that has lots of strategies on it. I have nothing against, okay, giving teachers lots of instructional strategies. So, for instance, I gave you the Freya model. I could have talked about think, pair, share, structure, think, pair, share. There are lots of strategies, and actually I think naming these strategies is quite important, because if you're going to remember these strategies, you need to be able to put a name on them in that kind of way. One of our problems, I think, as a community is we don't common language. Okay, I think it's getting better, okay, because there are more of these strategies that are in common parlance in that sense. So KWL charts, okay, what I know, what I want to know, and what I've learned, okay, is another one that people are using. So, in terms of what you might call tips, then I would say recommend the website. What we as a community have to do, and in some senses that's in the paper that I produced, which is a kind of summary, is to know what the evidence is for what we're recommending. I need to be able to say authoritatively to the people I stand in front and train to teach, you should be doing this, or you should know this particular strategy. Okay. If you never use it, okay, that's up to you. But you should know, for instance, again, what a concept map is, and why it might be something useful to either do before or afterwards, in that sense. Because in putting together a concept map, students have to think about the concept, think about what the interrelated connections are, okay, and they have to talk science in that sense. So I think there are many things out there. My only caveat is to say, don't put it forward to teachers, okay, unless you can provide, argue for it in terms of evidence for its value.
Okay. Because of time issue, I cannot accept more questions. I'm sorry. And if you have more questions and talk, you can use a break time, and you can send an email to Osborne. Okay. Thank you, Osborne. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, thank you all of us for the plenary session. I'm closing this plenary session. Thank you. Okay.